LACC for short. The Immigration Spotlight brings current information on the ever-changing situation at the US-Mexico borders, including news on migrants, asylum seekers, detainees, farm workers, and the impact of COVID-19 on these populations. I'm Mary Jean Friel, a Loretto co-member and member of LACC, and your moderator for today's Zoom. Today's program includes border updates from Nogales, Arizona and Mexico, El Paso and Ciudad Juarez, and the Tijuana-San Isidro borders. We have presentations by Loretto volunteers and also invited international guests from the United Nations High Commission for Refugee Volunteer Service. Each speaker will have 7 to 8 minutes to present. We aim to end in 1 hour, and for your information, part of this Zoom is being recorded. Now, our first speaker, Bob Key, is a humanitarian volunteer who works in and around Tucson, Arizona. He has been instrumental in establishing connections with detainees in the Eloy Detention Center for Women and the La Palma Detention Prison for Men. With Bob, the LACC has collaborated with the Freedom Fund to help bond out detainees from Eloy and La Palma, and to support the detainees who are in detention centers and unable to work now because of COVID-19, and to help when they are bonded out. Okay, Bob, you have the floor.
Okay, thank you. Good morning to everybody, and I hope everybody's doing well, physically and mentally. I really appreciate the time to be able to do this presentation, share information, and talk about the Freedom Fund and the importance of that. So first I'll talk about what's going on at the border. And many of you have been on border excursions and are familiar with the Commodore and Keno Border Initiative. So of course the border is still closed. So no asylum seekers are crossing right now, which presents a huge problem in Nogales, a real bottleneck there. The Commodore is still serving 1 meal a day. They serve it outside to people that come. And some of there's one of the larger shelters, because those that have gone to the border are familiar with Grupos Beta, the government agency that helps the migrants. Well, they closed. So there's no transportation for the migrants. So there's a lot of wandering that happens around the city. And so there's a lot of problems with the police and the migrants. One of the largest shelter, Juan Bosco, is now allowing the women and children to stay there during the day, which they never did. But that, presents a problem in itself. It's very monotonous. They can't move around. So it's a real struggle, and a lot of the people are thinking of going back. And the other problem that I knew would happen is that a lot of people are starting to cross in the desert because they can't wait. And I've encountered some of those women in Eloy. So that's kind of what's going on at the border. It's a hellish situation. I don't know, as far as the cases of the virus amongst that population, I don't know what's going on there. I don't have that information. I'll speak to someone later this afternoon and try to get that. So moving to Eloy and La Palma. I know La Palma, the last I'd heard, they had 56 cases of coronavirus. So they're under total quarantine. I don't know if the numbers are higher. Eloy says that they have no official cases of coronavirus. but they are in quarantine. When I talk to the women there, all the meals are served in their cells. So they're basically getting 3 lunches a day. And of course, the medical care is poor to non-existent. And one situation that exists right now that's really interesting for the people from Guatemala, that I have several women that I communicate with that have received orders of deportation, but they cannot return to Guatemala because the president will not accept anyone from the United States. So they're in limbo. They're just waiting in Eloy until they can actually physically be deported. I've had a couple of them wanting to go to Mexico, but that's not an option either. They can't do that. So instead of me talking about expressing what's going on, I want to share something from someone that's actually there, a woman that's there. This is her supplication letter that's been translated, and I'll just read briefly what she has to share and what's going on with her. She said, my family and I are afraid of my health due to the dangerous COVID-19 pandemic and the recent chickenpox outbreak in Eloy Detention Center. I have been detained for 6 months. I would like you to take into account that there is no deportation to Venezuela. Due to the amount of time I have been detained, I suffer from stress, loss of appetite, insomnia, hair loss, among other ailments. I have suffered from asthma from an early age, which I communicated to the doctor when I arrived to Eloy. I am afraid of the coronavirus, as it is known that with this illness, I am more susceptible to it. I beg of you from the bottom of my heart to take this into account. So this letter is the norm. It's not the exception. This is what's going on with so many of them. So moving to the Freedom Fund, which is such an important element of being able to do this work. And of course, I'm so grateful to LACC for this existing. And this is really a lifeline for the folks that are in La Palma and Eloy. So what the uses of the money from this fund, commissary is a huge one. Money that I send directly to people in letters. I'll write letters. And so fortunately, they are still able to receive the actual money in the letter. They haven't stopped me from doing that yet. So, this goes for soap and shampoo. They give them a trial size shampoo once a week, and that's supposed to last them the whole week. And if they run out, they either have to borrow or buy it, but that's it for the week. Water is essential. That's always one of the common prescriptions from the doctors. Drink a lot of water. Well, the water in the prison is horrible. Food, since they're getting 3 lunches a day, the food is terrible. Being able to get some tortillas or some ramen or some cookies or something is a real pleasure. So so I could be sending up to $100 a week or more on commissary. Phone calls, phone calls are a necessity for these people to emotionally, mentally, it's so important to have contact with their family, children. Probably spend $100 or more a week on phone calls. UPS, shipping out translated documents, in-country information for people to have for their court files, clothes when people are being deported. Western Union, I use that occasionally to put money into commissary funds. I try not to use it if I don't have to, because it costs me $5 a transaction. And books, which are so important. And I'm going to read a letter briefly from a young woman to let you know how important these books are. And then there are some miscellaneous items, stamps and envelopes and things like that.
Bob, you have a couple more minutes.
Okay. So one woman briefly wrote one day, she said, I've been here for 25 days. I'm thinking I've thought of committing suicide. The next day, from the same woman, I got a letter, and she said, I can't tell you how much I appreciate receiving this dictionary. She said, I didn't know how happy I would feel to have my own dictionary. And then she went on to say, you know, could you please send photos of the people that are a part of your project? And so last, to end up on a really positive note, with this money, we were able to bond out an 18-year-old woman from El Salvador. She sent me a letter saying, and she said, for $5,000, I can have my freedom. And so I called her, we connected, and I said, yes, you know, we can pay the bond. She started to cry, and she said, is this really true? And I said, of course it's true. So within two and a half weeks, we were able to bond her out. And that's why, you know, having this fund is so important. Having the fund and increasing the amount of money in here that's available for bond is extremely important to these people. So just, but let's you see who this young woman is. There she is. And I've messaged with her a couple times. She's in Texas with her sponsor, and she is so happy. So it was a great ending to that story. Thank you so
Where
much.
in Texas?
She's in Houston.
Oh, too bad. I'm in Dallas. Mm.
Yeah.
Thank you, Bob. Our next speaker is Ana Avandando, a Loreto volunteer who works as a paralegal at Las Americas Immigrant Advocacy Center in El Paso. Ana recently participated in an event we co-hosted called Building Bridges at the Border, Working for Justice, Acting for Peace. She will give an update on advocacy efforts in El Paso. Ana?
So I hope everyone can hear me. Does the sound fine? I don't know. Yeah.
Thumbs
Okay.
up.
Okay.
Good.
So as you mentioned, when we last spoke, I talked about our efforts to get people released based on the ticking time bomb. That was the mix between COVID and detention. And we are now seeing that ticking time bomb go off, and we're seeing all the effects from what we knew was going to happen since ICE didn't take the appropriate preventive measures to ensure that people will not die in their care. So we have now seen the second death due to ICE neglect. I don't know if you guys heard, but there was a man in Ohio. He was detained, and he died due to COVID shortly after being released. So that implies that we are not seeing the full scope of neglect, since they're releasing people that they know are at very high risk of death. And he might not have been the only one, but we will never know, because if they are released right before, it won't count as a death in their hands. So we see that ICE is not taking measures that are preventive or for the well-being of the people in their care. They're taking measures to essentially wipe the blood off their hands. So I work at Las Americas. We started writing petitions to free people that had what we call Fright Hat factors, which Fright Hat was a lawsuit where it was established that there are certain people with certain health conditions that are vulnerable to COVID and should be released. So we have started writing petitions for them to be released. And what we have seen is that every facility is taking a different approach, which just speaks to how disorganized ICE is and how they're not taking a unified approach to this as an organization. And this just lessens the accountability. It lessens how we can hold them accountable. So first, I will start to talk about the El Paso facility. The El Paso Processing Center has had multiple cases of COVID. It is now an outbreak. So we had one client, she's now released, to start off on a good note, but she was in the same dorm as the first person to test positive for COVID in the El Paso facility. And from her perspective, this is how it kind of started. So she mentioned that this person that tested positive had a fever for 3 days. She would not stop throwing up, and the only people taking care of her were the people in the same dorm, other people that were detained. Finally, she was taken into medical after 3 days of having a high fever, and she was never seen again, and she was the first case. But those 3 days where she had had the high fever, our client was in contact with her. They were in the same prayer group, holding hands, praying in very close contact. So right after, our client described how most of the guards acted very essentially disgusted by those people. In her own words, they acted as if the detained population was the one responsible for the outbreak of COVID. They wouldn't get close to them, they wouldn't talk to them, they wouldn't explain what was going on, and they wouldn't explain any measures that were being taken to prevent their death. Shortly after this first case, they started to come in and take their temperature. Medical started to come in and they would ask them, are you feeling okay? Or do you feel like you have a fever? And only if they said that they felt like they had a fever would they take their temperature. If they said they felt okay, they would be released back into the same dorm with everyone else, knowing that they might be asymptomatic and be carrying this disease. So it has now spread into an outbreak. Our client was released shortly after. She also mentioned that they were only getting 2 small sandwiches a day. So not only were they exposed to this virus, they were also exposed to starvation essentially, since 2 small sandwiches is nothing to be eating on a daily basis. There was a lawsuit at the El Paso facility that started. It was started by another organization, but there were 2 of our clients were included in the lawsuit. They essentially sued ICE. It was 6 women that had those fright hat factors. So they had health conditions that made them vulnerable to COVID. And they sued ICE, essentially saying, if you don't release us, this will go to court and it'll be a major lawsuit. Right before the lawsuit started, ICE released the 6 women. So this was ended. And right after, they started releasing a mass number of people. Right now, the El Paso Processing Center is at 36% capacity, and they won't release anyone else. And they're still putting people in danger because we recently heard that as a processing center, as opposed to a detention facility, they have to have people that are transferred out because there's certain statistics that they have to meet still. So they transferred an entire dorm of men to another facility, only to transfer them back. Just because as a processing center.
2 minutes, Anna.
Just because as a processing center, there's statistics that they have to meet. They keep moving people around, knowing that there's an outbreak still in the El Paso Center. And then there's another center that we work with. It's the Joe Corley Detention Center. I believe it's near Houston. It's in Conroe, Texas. They refuse to release anyone. There's been 32 cases of people detained that have COVID, 8 guards, and 1 death. We don't know if the death is COVID related or not. This was very recently put out. But we knew before that there were COVID cases because one of our clients was sent to solitary confinement where he was able to communicate through a very small window with other people in solitary confinement that told them, I am positive for COVID and I know that there's other people here that are positive. So they're not releasing anyone, and word for word, one of the deportation officers told one of our clients, you would have to be dying for us to release you.
All right.
We are preparing a similar lawsuit to the one that was done in El Paso against the Joe Corley facility. So we hope that this will start getting people out.
Okay. Thank you, Anna. We will hope to have time for questions at the end. I forgot to mention that, and we'll see. Next, I'd like to introduce Michael Nieto, who happens to be my son, and he is a restoration ecologist in the San Diego, San Isidro area. Michael has been around immigrant justice all his life, starting with the farm workers and then with immigrants in the barrios of Los Angeles and Long Beach. And most recent, and he also has been with Loretto in the closing of the School of the Americas and at the border. Recently, he has been involved with the volunteers from the UN. So in Tijuana. Michael, it's all yours.
Sure. Just wanted to, most of my experience in social justice work is directly related to the fact that Mary Jean is my mom. So she has a certain gravity about her that pulls things in, pulls people in. I wanted to introduce two friends of mine that kind of bumped into, and kind of when you're meeting people, they're two special folks from the UN. I do want to say though that they're speaking as private citizens right now, and is not as official representatives of the United Nations HCR. So be kind. One is Lisa McMunn. She works in Tijuana, kind of on the Mexican side of the border, runs their office, and you guys can correct me if I'm wrong. And then her counterpart on the San Diego border is Nathan Williams. So they work in conjunction with each other on border issues all along the northern border. And I think I'll turn it over to them to see. I don't know if they had anything prepared, but we invited them on the call just to get their perspective on things.
Now, last but certainly not least is Amy Maltz. Amy is a Loretto volunteer, originally from Oregon, who was stationed in New York to work at the UN as a Loretto at the UN volunteer. Amy covers the work of the NGO Committee on Migration and will report on global migration issues related to our work. Okay, Amy.
All right, well, thank you, and thanks for having me on the call this morning as well. Like Rosa has mentioned and Mary Jean has mentioned, Loretto at the UN recently had an event with LACC called Building Bridges at the Border, so it's nice that we get to kind of like continue some of the work and some of the collaboration as well. But for those who are unfamiliar, I'll just kind of quickly outline the context that I'm coming from, which is I work in the Loretto volunteer program, so just like Anna, but am placed at Loretto's office at the United Nations. So the Loretto community has had consultative status as an NGO with the United Nations for almost 30 years now. And we work on a variety of issues, all of which are identified as important by the Loretto community and all of the constituents with the Loretto community. But one of the ones we've been focusing on in particular is, of course, immigration and following that closely. So a lot of the work that NGOs in consultative status at the UN do is in collaboration with one another and on various working groups and committees. So one of the committees that we are active on is the UN NGO Committee on Migration, which serves as a mechanism for advocacy around issues of migration, kind of in line with the calendar year at the UN, and really serves to encourage the protection of migrants and human rights that's in line with the UN Charter. And the Committee on Migration is also a part of the Conference of Non-Governmental Organizations at the UN, so they also have consultative status with the UN. So kind of prior to the COVID-19 crisis, a lot of the focus areas that the committee was focusing on, they actually had 4 that they had identified for the 2018 to 2020 term. Those were implementation, follow-up, and review for the Global Compact for Migration, which was adopted by the UN General Assembly. Other focus areas were focusing on advocacy against xenophobia and for social inclusion, climate-induced displacement, and then refugee and migrant children. So our office, Loretto, at the UN was really, prior to COVID, working very closely with the climate-induced displacement subcommittee in trying to develop educational materials that are centered on narratives from migrants with lived experience with climate-induced migration and climate-induced displacement. But a lot of that work has kind of been paused due to COVID, but the committee is still really active and has still been meeting and has really focused its efforts on backing up, well, first, I guess, hearing and uplifting voices with lived experience. So ensuring that members are up to date on hearing from migrants from around the world who are willing to come and present about their experiences. But then secondly, also really following closely and supporting some of the advocacy measures and statements and petitions that are being put out kind of in the NGO circle that kind of supports the needs of migrants, especially in the time of COVID. So I'll kind of just touch on a couple of those because I think they're also kind of action items as well that people on the call might be interested in. But the first is that the Committee on Migration has been closely following the New York Immigration Coalition, which is a really wonderful organization that advocates for the rights of immigrants in New York City, which is of course where UN headquarters are. So the New York Immigration Coalition has put forth a petition that really identifies the need for life-saving isolation measures if possible, especially seeing as the city, like the essential workers in New York City, about 50% of them are immigrants themselves and don't have any access to any of the like financial relief packages that are available to people in the US and essential workers. So that's one petition that's available that I would really encourage people to take a peek at and sign, and I can maybe send that to Mary Jean or Rosa to redistribute for people if that's of interest. And then the other kind of, I guess, action item and something that the NGO Committee on Migration has been following closely is a statement that was released by the Civil Society Action Committee at the United Nations, which calls on states and governments to protect migrant and refugees in the crisis due to COVID-19. And specifically, I mean, they touch on several international measures and international legislation measures, but they specifically outline the statement from the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, which advocates and outlines the right to health for all, and specifically includes migrants in that call as well. So we're going to obviously continue to do our best to continue to bring together voices with lived experience and try to continue to stay as informed as possible and continue just to redistribute some of these calls to action and supports for NGOs worldwide that are advocating for migrants, especially during this pandemic. But yeah, I think that's kind of the update that I have. I can turn it back to you.
Thanks so much, Amy. Now, if anyone has questions, Sally will take over.
Okay.
We have a couple minutes for that. We're good on time. Any questions?
You know, if anyone has a question, you feel free to unmute yourself and start speaking. There's so many of us, I don't want to miss anybody here.
Okay, no questions? Anyone of the speakers, do you have a last minute something you would like to say? Anna, I think you got cut a little. You might have had more to say.
Just that we should continue our advocacy, and the more that all of these like injustices go public, the better, because ICE is trying their best to keep a lot hidden, and we shouldn't let it stay hidden because that's how they get away with things. So yeah, just continue doing advocacy work and staying informed and spreading the word.
Excellent. Bob, any last thoughts or?
I think what Anna said is so important, is to really having people become aware of what's going on in these facilities. I know it was shocking for, I know when your group went to Eloy, for many that went to find out, to hear from the people what's going on in these facilities, and to hear from them directly. As you know, so I think, you know, continuing to get the word out is so important.
And Bob, you said that more people are deciding to cross through the desert now.
Yes.
And so is the water still being dropped and food like before?
Yeah. So the desert work is still going on. You know, it hasn't stopped. You know, we're doing it in a way that, you know, there are only a couple people to a vehicle, or some of us are going out on our own, but the water's still being placed. And I knew this was going to happen, as, you know, people come from El Salvador and Honduras or wherever, and they can't wait at the border. And, you know, so the one thing is, when they do get apprehended, they do have an option for a bond. And that's, you know, so that's why it's so important to have money available when, you know, when these calls or letters come in saying, you know, I need money to get bonded out. And to be able to do that is huge.
Okay. Any other questions or comments? Beth?
Good morning or good afternoon all. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Thank you. My name's Beth Blissman. I'm the current United Nations representative at UN headquarters in New York. I have the pleasure of getting to work with Amy and trying hard, although it's a very difficult thing to do, to fill the shoes left by Sally, who had been in that position previously. And I just wanted to note, when we're following through on what Anna was asking for, to better publicize and tell the story about what is happening on the border, there are two different UN documents that we could be referring to. There's a compact on migration that Amy referred to that was brand new just a couple of years ago. That was the first time that compact had ever been created. It was passed, but there's a much older compact on refugees. And so in some ways, the complexity of the UN works against us, because these are two different documents. If I remember correctly, and please correct me if I'm wrong, yeah, the refugee work stems mostly out of Geneva, which is where most of the human rights efforts occur. And the Compact on Migration is based more at UN headquarters in New York. And I just recommend the Committee on Migration's website. Maybe we can include that, Amy, in whatever we send on, which kind of helps parse things out. And I don't know, Rosa or Sally, if you all know of any other places online where people could kind of learn the distinction between these two compacts and which ones we might want to draw upon when. But just wanted to make folks aware of those two documents. Thank you.
Thanks, Beth.
You know, Beth, to follow up on that, there's one other document I remember receiving out of Geneva from the Human Rights Commission called Human Rights at International Borders. I happened to get that just before I was going on my second border trip, and it's quite revealing. You know, the United States government is violating every page of that document, calling for human rights to be upheld at international borders. Yeah. And while I have the floor, I have a little tiny announcement I'd like to make. The organization that Anna is working at this year in El Paso, Las Americas, the executive director, Linda Rivas, has agreed to be the closing speaker at Loretto's Assembly this summer in July. So tune in. Yay.
Stay tuned.
Stay tuned, yes.
Okay, any other comments? Thank you all for tuning in today. And again, join the LACC on June 5th we are doing Immigration Spotlight every first and third Friday. So keep listening and join us then.
Thanks, Mary Jane.
Thank you all. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Ron.
Thanks so much.
Thank
Bye.
you.